Big Shaq never expected to see his former teacher homeless and broken. The man who once shaped his future had been discarded by a corrupt system. As Shaq digs deeper, he uncovers stolen pensions, greed, and a shocking betrayal. But when he fights back, powerful forces try to silence him. With everything on the line, Shaq refuses to walk away. Some debts can't be repaid with money, only with justice. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The winter air was sharp, cutting through the bustling streets like a blade. The sidewalks were alive with hurried footsteps, the distant wail of sirens, and the occasional honk of impatient drivers. The city hadn't changed much since the last time Shaq had been here. Same towering buildings, same restless energy. But for Shaq, this wasn't just another business trip. This was home. Dressed in a dark wool coat, Shaq strode down the street, his breath visible in the frigid air. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a reminder of his next meeting. But something pulled his attention away. A small crowd of pedestrians weaved around a figure hunched on the sidewalk, a cardboard sign propped against his knees. The man sat with his head down, wrapped in a tattered coat, his shoulders slumped against the cold. Shaq would have kept walking. He had seen homelessness before. It was an ugly reality of the world he lived in. But something about this man made his steps falter. His face, partially hidden by a graying beard, felt oddly familiar. Shaq's eyes narrowed. It couldn't be. His stomach tightened as he took a slow step forward. The man lifted his head at the sound of approaching footsteps, revealing a face etched with exhaustion, weathered by time and hardship. And in that instant, Shaq felt his world tilt. It was Mr. Aldridge, Shaq's former high school teacher. The man who had once told him, "You are capable of more than you think, Shaq. Don't let this world tell you otherwise." The man who had stayed after school to help him with college applications, who had refused to let him slip through the cracks. And now, that same man sat on a frozen sidewalk, his eyes dull and lifeless. Shaq swallowed hard. His first instinct was to call out, to rush forward, but his feet felt rooted to the pavement. How did this happen? How could a man like Aldridge, strong, disciplined, respected, end up here? A businessman in a sleek suit passed by without sparing him a glance. A woman in a fur-lined coat clutched her bag tighter as she stepped around him, her nose wrinkling slightly. The world was moving past him, as if he didn't exist. A flash of shame crossed Mr. Aldridge's face as he saw Shaq standing there. He shifted uncomfortably, as if willing himself to disappear. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice hoarse from the cold, Mr. Aldridge muttered, "Shaq?" Shaq took a shaky breath. He had been prepared to speak, to ask questions. But now, standing here, words felt utterly useless. "It's me, Mr. Aldridge." A bitter laugh escaped the older man's lips. "I figured," he murmured, looking away. "Didn't expect to see you here." Shaq crouched down, ignoring the sting of the cold pavement beneath his knees. "Didn't expect to see you here either," he admitted softly. Aldridge let out a slow breath, his shoulders sagging further. "Yeah," he muttered. "Neither did I." Shaq's throat tightened. The man who had once been a symbol of wisdom, discipline, and strength now sat before him, discarded like an afterthought. But Shaq wasn't about to leave him like this. The city noise faded into the background. Shaq's mind raced, flipping through the years like pages in a book. He remembered Mr. Aldridge's classroom, the walls covered in posters of historical leaders, motivational quotes scribbled on the board. He remembered late afternoons when Aldridge stayed behind to tutor struggling students. The man had been a force, unshakable, unwavering. And now, he looked defeated. Shaq cleared his throat. "Mr. Aldridge, what happened?" The former teacher let out a dry chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "What happened?" he echoed. "Life happened." His fingers tightened around the edges of his coat, as if holding himself together. Shaq waited, letting the silence stretch between them. He knew better than to push. Finally, Aldridge sighed. "Lost my wife 4 years ago." His voice was quieter now. "Bills piled up, medical debt, school cut budgets, and I was one of the first to go. Pension wasn't enough to keep up. One bad month turned into 2, then 3. And before I knew it, he gestured around him. The sidewalk, the cold, the people walking past without a glance. Shaq's jaw clenched. He had heard stories like this, seen the statistics. Teachers overworked, underpaid, left behind after giving everything to their students. But seeing Mr. Aldridge, the man who had once shaped his future, sitting in the gutter made it personal. "Why didn't you reach out?" Shaq asked, his voice quieter now. "I could have." Mr. Aldridge shook his head sharply. "No," he interrupted. "I wasn't going to beg my students for help." Shaq exhaled through his nose. "This isn't begging, Mr. Aldridge." A flicker of something passed through the older man's tired eyes. "It sure feels like it." Shaq understood. He knew pride. He knew what it was like to carry the weight of expectation, to feel like asking for help was the same as admitting defeat. But this wasn't just anyone. This was the man who had helped shape him into the person he was today. And Shaq wasn't about to walk away. Shaq glanced around. They were in the open, exposed to the world's indifference. This wasn't the place for this conversation. "Come with me," Shaq said, standing up and extending a hand. Mr. Aldridge hesitated. He looked down at his ragged coat, the dirt on his hands, the worn-out shoes on his feet. "I can't walk into a place like that," he muttered, nodding toward the sleek cafe across the street. "Not like this." Shaq didn't budge. "You think I care about that?" A long pause. Then, with a reluctant sigh, Aldridge took Shaq's hand. They crossed the street together, ignoring the stares. A waiter hesitated at the entrance, eyeing Aldridge warily. But Shaq shot him a look that shut down any questions before they could be voiced. Inside, the warmth was almost overwhelming after the biting cold outside. Shaq ordered food, hot coffee, things Aldridge hadn't had in a long time. But as the former teacher wrapped his hands around the steaming cup, his posture remained stiff. "I don't need charity, Shaq," he muttered. Shaq leaned forward. "This isn't charity, it's respect." Aldridge's grip on the cup tightened. For the first time since they had reunited, he looked Shaq directly in the eye. Something shifted. A silent understanding passed between them. This wasn't about handouts. This was about redemption. And Shaq had already decided. This wasn't where the story ended. The warmth of the cafe wrapped around them, a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. The scent of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, but Mr. Aldridge barely seemed to notice. He sat stiffly, his hands wrapped around the hot mug Shaq had placed in front of him, his eyes darting around the room like he didn't belong. Shaq studied him, taking in the sharp lines on his face, the way his coat sagged around his thinning frame. He had aged, more than he should have. The Mr. Aldridge Shaq remembered had been a man of purpose and conviction, always standing tall even in the face of defiant students. Now he sat hunched over, as if carrying the weight of a world that had long since forgotten him. "You gonna say something?" Shaq asked, his voice calm but firm. Aldridge didn't look up. He took a slow sip of his coffee, staring into the dark liquid like it held the answers to everything. "Not much to say." Shaq leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "I think there is." Aldridge let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Look, kid, I appreciate the gesture, but you don't need to do this. I'm fine." Shaq's eyes narrowed. "You call this fine?" Aldridge's jaw tightened. "It's temporary." Shaq exhaled through his nose, his patience thinning. "Mr. Aldridge, people don't just wake up one day and find themselves living on the street. Talk to me." For a second, Aldridge looked like he might, like he wanted to. But then, just as quickly, his expression hardened. "It's complicated." Shaq sat back in his chair. "Try me." Aldridge scoffed. "Look at you," he muttered, "sitting here in a $1,000 coat like you've got the world figured out. You don't understand." Shaq's patience cracked. "You're right," he said, his voice sharper now. "I don't understand. Because the man I knew, the man who stood in front of a classroom full of kids and told us we could be more, would never let this happen to himself." That hit its mark. Aldridge flinched, his grip tightening on his coffee cup. The silence stretched between them, thick and unyielding. Then finally, Aldridge let out a bitter laugh. You think I wanted this? He murmured. You think I didn't fight? Shaq didn't answer. He let the words settle, let Aldridge find his way through them. The old man ran a hand over his face, his shoulders sagging. I had a life, he said, his voice quieter now. A home. A wife. Students who gave me hell but who I loved anyway. And then, life happened. Shaq didn't push, just nodded for him to continue. Aldridge sighed. My wife got sick. The kind of sick that drains more than just your soul. The kind that empties your bank account too. His fingers traced the rim of his mug. I spent everything on her treatments. The house, the savings, gone. And then she was too. Shaq swallowed hard. He had heard about Mrs. Aldridge passing, but not like this. Aldridge continued, his voice tight. I figured I could rebuild. But life doesn't work that way. The school started cutting budgets. Senior teachers cost too much. One day I was a respected educator. The next I was expendable. Shaq's fists clenched under the table. They fired you? Aldridge huffed out a humorless laugh. They called it an early retirement package, said I should be grateful. His expression darkened. Pension wasn't enough to cover the bills. I picked up part-time jobs, but they don't hire men my age for much. One bad month turned into 2, then 3. Before I knew it, I was out of options. Shaq felt his blood boil. A man like this, a man who had dedicated his life to shaping the future, left with nothing. It was infuriating. You should have called me, Shaq said, his voice tight. Aldridge shook his head. And say what? Hey, remember me? Your high school teacher who told you to never give up. Well, turns out I gave up. He scoffed. Number. That's not how I was raised. Shaq exhaled, pressing his fingers against his temple. This isn't about pride, Mr. Aldridge. It's about survival. The old man's eyes flickered with something. Shame. Frustration. Maybe both. Survival, he echoed. That's exactly what I've been doing. Shaq shook his head. Number, what you've been doing is disappearing. A waitress approached, setting down 2 plates of food. A hot meal, something Aldridge probably hadn't had in weeks. Aldridge hesitated before picking up his fork. Shaq saw it, the flicker of hesitation, the silent debate in his head. He was hungry, but he hated this. Hated needing help. He took a small bite, then another. Shaq waited until Aldridge had eaten a few more bites before speaking again. I'm not letting you go back to that sidewalk. Aldridge tensed. Shaq, no. Shaq's voice was firm. You think this is where your story ends? Nah, not happening. Aldridge sighed, shaking his head. You don't get it. Shaq leaned forward. Then explain it to me. Aldridge placed his fork down carefully. I don't need saving. Shaq's gaze didn't waver. And I'm not here to save you. Aldridge frowned. I'm here to remind you who you are, Shaq said, his voice steady. The man who never let me quit. The man who stayed after school to make sure kids like me didn't fall through the cracks. The man who told us that no matter how many times life knocks you down, you get back up. Aldridge's jaw tightened. That man is gone. Shaq shook his head. No, he's not. The silence between them was thick. Then, Aldridge exhaled, rubbing his temples. What do you want from me, Shaq? Shaq leaned back, giving him space. I want you to take my help. No strings, no pity, just one man looking out for another. Aldridge's fingers twitched against the edge of the table. You always said we had to take chances, Shaq added. This is yours. Aldridge let out a slow, weary breath. For the first time that night, he looked less like a man drowning, and more like a man considering reaching for the shore. The meal continued in quiet understanding. Aldridge ate, his movements slower but more relaxed. As they finished, Shaq pulled out his phone. I booked you a hotel for the night. No arguing. Aldridge opened his mouth to protest but stopped himself. The fight was still there, but so was something else. Relief. Just for the night, Aldridge muttered. Shaq smirked. We'll see about that. Aldridge shook his head, but there was a ghost of a smile there, buried under years of exhaustion. Shaq didn't know if he had won the battle, but for the first time, He felt like he had broken through the wall. And that was the first step. Shaq sat in his car outside Lincoln High, staring at the brick walls that once held so many memories. It felt surreal to be back. This was the place where he'd learned discipline, where he'd been pushed to his limits, where Mr. Aldridge had stood in front of a classroom and believed in him before anyone else did. And now, that same man had been discarded, forgotten. Shaq tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched. He had heard stories about teachers struggling, about schools cutting budgets. But he had never imagined it would come to this. Not to Mr. Aldridge. He exhaled sharply, pushing open the car door. If he wanted to understand what had really happened, he needed answers. The school felt different now. The hallways were quieter, the energy duller, like the place had lost its heart. He had set up meetings with old classmates, former colleagues of Mr. Aldridge, and even the school board. The responses ranged from shock to indifference. First was David Kendrick, an old classmate who had once been a star athlete. Now he was a local gym owner, someone who still kept his ear to the ground. "You serious?" David asked, shaking his head when Shaq told him about Aldridge. "Man, that guy was a legend. How the hell does a teacher like that end up on the street?" Shaq's expression was grim. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." David sighed, leaning back in his chair. "We lost a lot of good teachers when the school board cut funding. Mr. Aldridge wasn't the only one." Shaq's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" David rubbed his jaw, glancing around before lowering his voice. "A couple years back, the district started cutting back on senior teachers. They said it was cost efficiency. But we all knew what it really was. They wanted cheaper staff." Shaq exhaled sharply. "So they just pushed him out?" David nodded. "More like forced him out. Gave them retirement offers that weren't enough to live on. A lot of them fought back, but Aldridge? He was too damn proud. Wouldn't beg for anything. That stung." Shaq could already picture it. Aldridge standing in front of some bureaucratic suit, refusing to grovel. He probably walked out of that office thinking he could make it work. He had no idea how fast the world would turn on him. Shaq's next stop was Ms. Lorraine, an old administrator who had worked at the school for decades. She had retired last year, but still kept in touch with the teaching staff. She sighed when she heard Shaq's reason for visiting. "Teachers have been underpaid for years. We don't do this for the money. We do it because we care. But the district, the higher-ups, they don't care about loyalty. They care about budgets." Shaq leaned forward. "So they cut teachers like Aldridge to save money?" Ms. Lorraine's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes, and no. See, it's not just about cutting costs, it's about control. The fewer experienced teachers we have, the easier it is to push standardized tests, new policies, and whatever else lines the pockets of the people in charge." Shaq's stomach turned. "So they replaced real educators with cheaper hires who wouldn't push back." Ms. Lorraine nodded. "Exactly. And once you're out, good luck getting back in. Schools don't want old teachers. They want cheap ones." Shaq left the meeting feeling a deep, simmering anger. How was it possible that the people who shaped the future were treated as disposable? Determined to do something, he called in a favor. Within an hour, he was sitting in the office of Charles Whitmore, a high-ranking school board official. Whitmore was the kind of man who wore tailored suits and a fake smile, someone who pretended to care but had never stepped foot in a real classroom. "Shaquille," Whitmore greeted, shaking his hand a little too firmly. "I heard you were asking questions. How can I help?" Shaq didn't waste time. "Mr. Aldridge, why was he forced out?" Whitmore's expression barely shifted. "I'm afraid I don't know the details of every case." "Cut the crap," Shaq interrupted. "This wasn't just about budgets. Teachers like Aldridge were pushed out." Whitmore sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Shaq, you have to understand. Education is a business just like anything else. Schools need to adapt, and that sometimes means making difficult decisions." Shaq's jaw clenched. "Difficult? You mean throwing out the people who actually care?" Whitmore remained unfazed. "I understand this is personal for you, but the system is what it is. If Mr. Aldridge struggled after retirement, that's unfortunate. But it's not the school's responsibility." Shaq let out a humorless chuckle. Right. Not your responsibility. Just like all the other teachers you tossed aside. Whitmore's smile thinned. You can be upset, but this isn't something you can fix overnight. Shaq met his gaze head on. Watch me. As Shaq dug deeper, he realized something else. Not everyone wanted him asking questions. Within days, he started getting pushback. Phone calls went unanswered. Meetings were suddenly canceled. And then, one night, he got a call from David. Bro, David's voice was tense. I don't know what you did, but people are not happy. Shaq frowned. What people? David hesitated. Let's just say some big names don't like you poking around. This goes deeper than just Aldridge. There's money in this. Shaq gripped his phone tighter. You telling me someone's making money off this mess? David exhaled. I'm telling you they don't want you finding out. Shaq's mind raced. How deep did this go? Who was profiting off the destruction of educators? One thing was clear. He wasn't backing down. The more Shaq uncovered, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't just about Mr. Aldridge. It was about an entire system designed to strip teachers of their worth. And if the people in charge thought he would walk away, they were dead wrong. Shaq wasn't just going to fix this. He was going to burn the whole corrupt system down. Shaq sat in his downtown office, staring at the files spread across his desk. Something wasn't adding up. The more he dug, the more disturbing the picture became. Mr. Aldridge wasn't the only teacher who had been forced out. In fact, dozens of senior educators in the district had suddenly retired or lost their jobs over the past few years. And it wasn't just bad luck. School funding reports were riddled with redacted numbers, missing amounts, and unapproved budget cuts. Pension accounts had been drained. Bonuses for teachers were mysteriously denied while executive salaries skyrocketed. Someone had stolen from the very people who built the future. And Shaq intended to find out who. Following the money, a trail of lies, Shaq called in a favor from an old friend, Elijah Banks, a forensic accountant who specialized in uncovering fraud. Within hours, Elijah had traced the missing funds to a series of shell companies linked to one name, Callaway, Martin Callaway. A high-ranking administrator in the district, Callaway had a reputation for being calculating, ruthless, and untouchable. He had been involved in multiple restructuring efforts that conveniently cut senior staff while shifting millions into administrative costs. But the real smoking gun? A secret fund, one worth millions, hidden under operational expenses. Money that should have gone to teachers like Mr. Aldridge. Shaq's blood boiled. This wasn't mismanagement. This was theft. And Callaway was right at the center of it. Shaq didn't waste time. He arranged a meeting with Callaway under the pretense of discussing philanthropic investments in education. The office was as polished and cold as the man himself. Expensive leather chairs, glass walls, a city skyline that stretched endlessly behind him. Callaway sat behind a sleek desk, his sharp suit tailored to perfection. Mr. Simmons? Callaway greeted, offering a fake smile. A pleasure. I hear you're interested in education reform. Shaq sat down, but his stare was razor sharp. I'm interested in justice. Callaway's smile faltered just slightly. Justice? He let out a light chuckle. That's a broad term. What exactly are we discussing? Shaq placed a folder on the desk and slid it forward. Callaway didn't even look at it. I already know what's in there, Callaway said smoothly, folding his hands together. You think you found something big, don't you? Shaq's jaw tightened. I found the money, the stolen pensions, the cuts that weren't mistakes. I know exactly what you did. Callaway exhaled slowly, then leaned forward. Let me ask you something, Shaquille. Do you think schools run on passion? That teachers get to just exist without understanding how the world works? Shaq didn't answer. Callaway smirked. You think money just appears? This is how the system works. You cut where you can, you move funds where they benefit the right people. It's business. That's the reality. Shaq's fists curled under the table. You're talking about people's lives. Callaway shrugged. And? Shaq exhaled slowly, his anger burning through him like wildfire. You're done, Callaway. Callaway's smirk returned, this time more amused than nervous. Are you threatening me? Shaq shook his head. I don't threaten, I will expose. That wiped the smirk off Calloway's face. That night, as Shaq drove back to his hotel, his phone buzzed with an unknown number. A voice. Calm, slow, deliberate. You're playing a dangerous game, Mr. Simmons. Shaq's grip tightened on the wheel. Who is this? The voice ignored the question. Some things are bigger than one man. Some things are better left alone. Shaq's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about a corrupt administrator. Someone else was pulling the strings. Someone who had just told him to back off. The next morning, Shaq met with Elijah again. How deep does this go? He asked. Elijah hesitated. Deeper than we thought. The pension money wasn't just stolen. It was redirected into private accounts, real estate, offshore investments, political donations. He exhaled. This isn't just Calloway. This is a network. Shaq ran a hand down his face. Of course it was bigger. Which means, he asked. Elijah hesitated. Which means they won't let you take them down easily. Shaq already knew that, but he wasn't stopping. Shaq contacted a journalist he trusted, Eleanor Tate, an investigative reporter who had a reputation for taking down untouchable men. You're sure about this? Eleanor asked, her eyes sharp. This isn't just a hit piece. This is exposing an entire system. Shaq nodded. I want the truth out there. She studied him for a moment, then leaned forward. All right, let's burn it down. Hours later, Shaq's assistant rushed into his office, panic in her eyes. Sir, there's a problem. She handed him a cease and desist letter. Shaq barely skimmed it before tossing it aside. They're trying to shut you up, Elijah muttered. Shaq's lips curled into a humorless smile. Let them try. But just as he said it, his phone buzzed. Another unknown number. This time the voice was colder, more direct. You've had your fun. Walk away or we bury you. Shaq exhaled slowly. Now it was war. Shaq sat down with Eleanor and Elijah. If we go at them head on, they'll bury this. Eleanor nodded. Then we don't go head on. We build a case so solid, so undeniable that it's too big to silence. Elijah pulled out documents. We expose the paper trail, the missing funds, the connections. We make it public before they can cover their tracks. Shaq leaned forward. And we take them all down. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about justice. For Mr. Aldridge. For every teacher who had been thrown away. For every student who had lost a mentor to greed. That night, Shaq received one final call. Last chance, the voice warned. Take the money. Drop this, or things get messy. Shaq's response was simple. See you in court. And with that, the battle had officially begun. Shaq had faced obstacles before. He had fought through challenges, doubters, and adversity to build his empire. But this was different. This wasn't just about him. This was about Mr. Aldridge, about the teachers who had been discarded, about a system built to crush the very people who shaped the future. And Shaq wasn't backing down. The first call Shaq made was to Eleanor Tate, the fearless journalist who had taken down corrupt officials before. She had a reputation for being relentless, and this was exactly the kind of case she thrived on. You're telling me public school funds were siphoned into private accounts? She said, her voice sharp with interest. And you have proof? Shaq smirked. I have more than proof. I have a name. Eleanor was in. Next, he called Jonathan King, a civil rights attorney who specialized in exposing corporate fraud. They'll try to bury this, Jonathan warned. People like Calloway have connections. Shaq's voice was steady. Then we dig deeper. Jonathan agreed. Lastly, Shaq reached out to community activists, former teachers, and parents who had been affected by the broken system. He set up meetings, listened to their frustrations, and gathered testimonies. One thing was clear. This wasn't just about Mr. Aldridge. This was bigger. While Shaq worked on taking down the system, he also focused on helping the man who had helped him. He got Mr. Aldridge into temporary housing, hired a doctor to assess his health, and got him a set of new clothes. The transformation was slow, but necessary. But there was one battle Shaq couldn't fight for him. The battle inside Mr. Aldridge's mind. One evening, Shaq stopped by the small apartment he had arranged for Mr. Aldridge. but as soon as he walked in, he froze. Mr. Aldridge stood near the door, a small bag packed at his feet. His shoulders were tense, his face twisted in an expression of shame and uncertainty. "I can't do this," Mr. Aldridge said, shaking his head. "This isn't me." Shaq's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Mr. Aldridge swallowed hard, avoiding Shaq's eyes. "I don't belong here. I don't deserve all this." Shaq clenched his jaw. "Don't do that, don't say that." Mr. Aldridge let out a hollow laugh. "Look at me. I was a teacher, a mentor, and now I'm just—" He gestured helplessly. "I don't even know who I am anymore." Shaq stepped forward, his voice firm but full of emotion. "You're Mr. Aldridge, the man who believed in me when no one else did, the man who gave me hope when I had none. And now it's my turn." Mr. Aldridge's eyes filled with tears. "But what if I can't come back from this?" Shaq's voice softened. "Then I'll fight until you do." A silence stretched between them. And for the first time in years, Mr. Aldridge saw something in Shaq's eyes that he hadn't seen in himself for a long time. Belief. A belief that he was still worth saving. The next morning, Shaq and his team launched the first strike. Eleanor published an explosive article detailing the corruption within the education system. The story included real numbers, stolen pensions, and first-hand testimonies from former teachers who had been discarded. Within hours, social media erupted. Parents were outraged. Teachers shared their own stories. The pressure mounted as news stations picked up the scandal. And Calloway? He wasn't smiling anymore. That evening, Shaq received a legal notice. Calloway was suing him for defamation. Jonathan King read through the document and chuckled. "They're scared." Shaq smirked. "Good." But then the real threat came. Another anonymous call. This time, the voice wasn't calm. It was angry. "You're making enemies, Simmons. Keep pushing, and we'll make sure you regret it." Shaq's grip tightened around his phone. "You people don't scare me." A pause. Then the voice said, "Then maybe we'll go after someone else." Shaq's blood ran cold. They weren't threatening him. They were threatening Mr. Aldridge. Shaq didn't waste a second. He called 2 of his most trusted security personnel and stationed them at Mr. Aldridge's apartment. No one was getting near him. Then he met with Jonathan and Eleanor. "They're getting desperate," he said, "which means we're close." Eleanor tapped her pen against the table. "Then let's finish this." Shaq arranged for a live press conference, standing side by side with Mr. Aldridge, former teachers and parents. They told their stories. They exposed the fraud, the betrayals, the stolen futures. And in that moment, the tide turned. The school board, under immense public pressure, announced an immediate internal investigation. Officials who once defended Calloway now distanced themselves. And Calloway? He had nowhere left to run. A week later, an arrest warrant was issued for Martin Calloway. Charges: embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. When cameras caught him being led away in handcuffs, he refused to look at them. He had spent years stealing from those who trusted him. And now, he was the one discarded. With Calloway gone, things started changing. Pensions were reinstated. Teachers were rehired. Community leaders demanded accountability. And Mr. Aldridge? One evening, he sat across from Shaq at a diner. He looked different. He had a fresh haircut, a new suit. There was life in his eyes again. I got an offer," he said hesitantly. Shaq leaned forward. "Yeah?" Mr. Aldridge nodded. "A mentorship program, helping struggling teachers find their way back." He exhaled. "They want me to lead it." Shaq grinned. "Sounds perfect." Mr. Aldridge swallowed, emotion thick in his voice. "I wouldn't have gotten here without you." Shaq shook his head. "You would have. I just reminded you who you are." That night, as Shaq walked back to his car, he looked up at the sky and exhaled. Mr. Aldridge had saved him once, and now, Shaq had saved him right back. Because that's what teachers do. They change lives, and no system, no corruption, no greed could ever erase that. Shaq had fought battles before, on the court, in boardrooms, in life. But this, This was different. This wasn't about winning a game. This was about justice. And everyone was watching. The moment Shaq and his team went public with the scandal, the internet exploded. News stations picked up the story. Teachers, students, parents, all enraged. Social media was flooded with demands for answers. Who was responsible? Who let this happen? The hashtag #Justice for Teachers trended nationwide. But the real blow came when Shaq released the evidence. Documents, emails, bank records showing the missing funds, videos of teachers speaking out. And at the center of it all, Martin Calloway, a man who had spent years stealing from the very people who shaped young minds. The city's officials, desperate for damage control, arranged a public town hall meeting. They hoped to calm the outrage, control the narrative. They had no idea what was coming. The event was held in the largest auditorium in town. Reporters packed the seats. Cameras rolled, broadcasting the event live to the nation. Shaq sat in the front row, arms crossed, waiting. At the center of the stage, Calloway sat stiffly, trying to appear composed. His suit was crisp, but his eyes flickered with unease. He knew. He was running out of time. The meeting opened with empty apologies. A local official, Mayor Whitaker, took the podium first. "We are deeply sorry for the concerns raised," Shaq scoffed. Concerns? This wasn't about concerns. This was about lives destroyed. Then Calloway stepped forward. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat. "There has been a misunderstanding," he began smoothly. "The budget cuts were unavoidable due to unforeseen financial constraints." Shaq raised an eyebrow. Unforeseen. He stood up. The entire room turned toward him. "Let me get this straight," Shaq said, his voice calm but firm. "You're saying the missing funds were a financial accident?" Calloway forced a smile. "That's exactly what I'm saying." Shaq nodded. "Good. Because I have something to clear up that misunderstanding." He turned to the side, and the screens behind him lit up. Emails, bank statements, documents showing Calloway's signature approving the transfers. Millions of dollars. Gone. The audience gasped. Reporters scribbled notes. Calloway's face drained of color. Shaq wasn't done. He gestured to the side of the stage. "And in case that's not enough, let's hear from the people you stole from." One by one, former teachers stepped forward. A retired math teacher, voice shaking. "I worked 35 years, and my pension disappeared overnight. I lost my home. A single mother, once a beloved English teacher. I had to choose between feeding my kids or keeping the lights on. And then, Mr. Aldridge." The room fell dead silent as Mr. Aldridge took the microphone. His hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, from years of being ignored. He took a slow breath. Then he spoke. "I dedicated my life to teaching," he said, voice raw. "I stayed late, helped struggling kids, gave everything I had to the classroom." He scanned the crowd, his gaze steady. "And when I needed help?" His voice cracked. "I was abandoned." A wave of murmurs spread through the crowd. "I didn't just lose my job. I lost my home, my dignity, my belief in people." He turned to Calloway. "You did that." Calloway visibly flinched. Mr. Aldridge straightened, his strength returning. "But I'm standing here today because someone reminded me that I mattered." He looked at Shaq. "And I won't let you take that from anyone else." The room erupted. Calloway stood frozen. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead. He knew. He had lost. Reporters shouted questions. "Mr. Calloway, do you deny the allegations? Where did the money go? Will you resign?" Shaq took one step closer. Calloway took a step back. "You spent years taking from these people," Shaq said, his voice low, cutting. "But here's the thing about people like you." Shaq leaned in slightly. "You always think no one's watching." Calloway's jaw tightened. Shaq smirked. "Until it's too late." The next morning, Calloway resigned in disgrace. A criminal investigation was launched. The stolen funds? Recovered. The city announced immediate pension reinstatements for affected teachers. And Mr. Aldridge? 2 weeks later, Shaq met him at a local diner. Mr. Aldridge looked different, healthier, hopeful. "I got an offer," he said hesitantly. Shaq grinned. Yeah? A mentorship program, helping struggling teachers find their way back. He exhaled. They want me to lead it. Shaq nodded. Perfect. Mr. Aldridge swallowed hard. I wouldn't have gotten here without you. Shaq shook his head. You would have. He smiled. I just reminded you who you are. That night, Shaq sat in his car, staring at the city lights. Mr. Aldridge had saved him once. And now, Shaq had saved him right back. Because that's what teachers do. They change lives. And no system, no corruption, no greed could ever erase that. The battle had been fought, the truth had been exposed, and justice had been served. But for Shaq, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Mr. Aldridge wasn't just a man who had been failed by the system. He was proof that too many had been. And Shaq wasn't about to let that happen again. A week after the town hall, Shaq called a meeting in his downtown office. The sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows as a group of educators, business leaders, and community advocates filled the conference room. At the head of the table sat Mr. Aldridge, looking almost out of place in his crisp new suit. He had regained some weight, his posture stronger, his eyes holding a spark that had once been lost. Shaq cleared his throat. We're launching the Aldridge Foundation. Murmurs spread through the room. The goal is simple, Shaq continued. No teacher, no educator should ever go through what Mr. Aldridge did. He looked around the table. We're setting up emergency housing for struggling teachers, legal aid for those being cheated out of pensions, and mental health resources to make sure no one falls through the cracks. The room was silent, not out of disinterest, but because they were in awe. Then the applause started. It was official. The fight wasn't just about fixing the past, it was about protecting the future. For weeks, Mr. Aldridge worked alongside Shaq, helping shape the foundation's programs. But something still weighed on him. One evening, as they walked through the newly established teacher housing complex, Mr. Aldridge finally voiced it. I'm grateful for all this, he said quietly, hands in his coat pockets. But I can't help thinking about the others, the ones who didn't have a Shaq to step in. Shaq exhaled, understanding the weight of those words. We can't change the past, Shaq said, but we can make sure their stories meant something. Mr. Aldridge nodded, staring at the lit-up windows of the housing complex. Then let's make sure we do it right. And from that night on, he did more than just help. He led. Months later, the foundation's launch was celebrated in a packed ballroom. Teachers, students, activists, and even city officials filled the venue. At the front table, Mr. Aldridge sat between Shaq and Rachel, the woman who had first spoken up on the plane. He still wasn't used to the attention, but as he looked out at the crowd, a room full of people who now cared, who were now fighting for the very people who built the future, he felt something he hadn't in years. Pride. When Shaq took the stage, the room quieted. We talk a lot about heroes, Shaq began. Athletes, celebrities, CEOs. He shook his head. But the real heroes? He turned toward Mr. Aldridge. They're the ones who show up every day, underpaid, undervalued, and still give their all to kids who need them. Applause rippled through the crowd. Shaq smiled. So, here's to the ones who never get the spotlight. He raised his glass. To the teachers. The room erupted in cheers. As the night wound down, Shaq and Mr. Aldridge stepped outside onto the balcony, the city skyline glowing behind them. The older man exhaled deeply, taking it all in. You know, Mr. Aldridge said, his voice quieter now. I used to sit in my classroom wondering if I ever really made a difference. Shaq turned to him. You did. Mr. Aldridge chuckled softly. Yeah, I guess I finally see that now. He looked over at Shaq, his expression shifting. You saved me, he admitted. And I'll never be able to thank you enough for that. Shaq shook his head. No. He smiled. You saved me first. And for the first time in a long time, Mr. Aldridge didn't argue. Because for the first time, he truly believed it. As Shaq and Mr. Aldridge stood side by side, two men forever connected by something bigger than both of them, the camera slowly pulled away. It captured a city where teachers would never be forgotten again. because one student, who once needed saving, had come back to save them all. And that changed everything. This story isn't just about one man. It's about all the unsung heroes who give everything and get nothing in return. How many more teachers, mentors, and role models are struggling in silence? It's time to stand up, speak out, and fight for those who shaped our future. Share this story, start the conversation, and be part of the change. Because real heroes should never be forgotten. Follow us for more powerful stories that inspire action.